Welcome to another Britflicks.com podcast. My name's Stuart, Wright, and I'm pleased to have Kier-La Janisse on the podcast. Welcome to the show.
Hello, thanks for having me.
It is absolutely my pleasure. We have come together to talk about your epic documentary, Woodlands, Dark and Days Bewitched, which hit Shudder. Was it this year?
I think it was. When did it hit Shudder? I can't remember now whether it's all been a blur really since it came out. It was out. It premiered in like March of 21, and it may have hit Shudder actually in the fall. No, it was like January of this year, I think.
But what we can say to people listening in, it is available to watch now on Shudder. Yes. That is without a shadow of a doubt.
And I think they have a whole bunch of the folk horror movies that are in the documentary on Shudder as well.
I noticed, yes. Yeah. So, and what we're going to do after we've talked a little bit about your documentary is we're going to focus on 5 films that are featured in the documentary with you. But before we do that, and so people know what it's about, do you want to give a sort of brief description as to what Woodlands Dark and Days Bewitched is?
Okay, it's like a 3-hour and 14-minute documentary about. I guess I would say, it's advertised as like the history of folk horror, but I would actually say it's almost more like a critical exploration of folk horror. Beginning with the Holy Trinity of folk horror, which is like Blood on Satan's Claw, Witchfinder General, and The Wicker Man, and then kind of branching out from there and questioning a lot about how people define folk horror, how people in different cultures define folk horror, and what it means when it's under different political systems and different cultural systems and stuff like that. And just kind of like, starting with a very firm beginning of like British folk horror and going through all the kind of British folk horror classics from film and television. And then being like, okay, going out from there, like, what does it look like in the rest of the world, And then kind of in the end, questioning like, why are we so interested? Why does this resonate? Why does it resonate now specifically? And it was interesting because when I first finished it, obviously there were a lot of political things happening when I was working on the documentary. But by the time I was finishing it, like the last year of editing, we were in COVID lockdown and stuff. So, I mean, it became even more resonant, I think, because of that, because people started actually like moving out to the country again and started learning more about self-sustaining with, home gardening and like all of these issues that were kind of coming up in the film related to like the 70s. Interest in folk horror were all kind of coming back because
literally Mother Earth was taking revenge on us.
Yes.
Nature was coming back to us and sending us out to it all at the same time. It was quite an amazing thing, yeah. I would say, I mean, on a second watch of the film, I really, really sort of leaned into the sort of geopolitical side of it, because the first time I watched it, I was like pad and paper, like trying to keep up with the films you were throwing at us. Because I was like, I've not seen that one. I've not seen that one. I actually gave up the first time trying to, because it was like, this is ridiculous. And I love the fact that, I mean, I went in so cold. I mean, I don't know of other people's experiences going into cold. I was fully aware of the Holy Trinity, as it were. I'm thinking, how's she going to get 3 hours out of this? And then the film just opens up into this massive story of folk storytelling, really, around the world. And I can only just congratulate on how much the globe you managed to cover, and what a big story folk horror is in a way. Yeah,
it was really important to me to kind of get out from under this preconception a lot of people had that folk horror was British. You know, that it was a British thing. It was a British history in film, that all the examples were British, and that anything that wasn't British was inspired by British films or relating back in some way to British attitudes, through colonialism and stuff, and so as I started to look at what folk horror looks like from other perspectives, like what if your starting point isn't British? What if your starting point is like, you are an African-American person who lives in the South of the US, your entryway to folk horror might be very, very different.
Absolutely.
And that's what proved to be the case. Like when I wasn't done the film, but I was kind of like in the last year of editing it, we did a panel at the Fantasia Film Festival because the movie wasn't ready, but they thought folk horror was a hot topic. They wanted to do a panel about it, and they asked me to curate it. And I had this one scholar named Kenitra Brooks, who had written this excellent book called Searching for Sikorax. And in that book, she had a couple of chapters kind of focused on folk horror, but from a very different perspective that was very inspired by the writings of, and the ethnographic research of Zora Neale Hurston and the whole history of like the Conjure Woman and like all these things in like, you know, Appalachian and Southern US mythology and spiritualities and stuff. And so I said something in our very first Zoom meeting about that panel when we were preparing for the panel. I said something like, okay, we're going to start with British folk horror because everything kind of starts there. And she was like, what's British folk horror?
No.
And I was like, you know, like blah, blah, blah. And I started naming the movies. She's like, I never heard of any of those movies.
Amazing. Amazing.
And I was like, really? I was like, wow, this is really exciting.
Yeah, hold on to your hats.
And that was a big part of, she ended up being so busy, I couldn't actually get her in the movie. So she's in the panel and not the movie. But that was it just showed me how much I was perpetuating that too, you know, in conversation and stuff. And hearing her say that and just be like, I have no idea what you're talking about, what British folk are, you know, was amazing to me because I was like, yes, the movie has to have this, you know, it has to have these other perspectives where it's like, it does not begin with British folk horror for that, you know? And so then I started looking at the film when we started editing it, each section of the film, because there's kind of like different chapters and each chapter's kind of has a different editing, mandate in a way, you know? So the British section, somebody complained online. They're like, oh, the British section is the least critical. And I was like, yeah, that's true, because part of what we're doing in that British signposts section, which is what it's called, signposts of British folk horror, is we're really giving you the greatest hits list in terms of like what everybody thinks is folk horror. You know, like when most people think of folk horror, these are all the films that they're going to name, you know, because for most people, even most of the people I interviewed, you know, like a lot of them did come to it with this idea that it was kind of like a British thing first, you know? And so it was kind of like starting with that, like, okay, these are your expectations. You know, this is everything that you expect from a folk horror movie. And then we're going to question that, you know? So it was kind of like the American section was very geographical, the way it was edited. It started with like the colonies, and then it branched out throughout the US according to a certain trajectory that took us through different areas of the US so that we could investigate the ways that folk horror manifested in these different regions based on the immigration patterns of those places. And then when we got to the international section, which was definitely the most ambitious in its editing approach, was that we were actually trying to weave all the countries together in terms of like what imagery do folk horror films, like what themes and imagery and stuff do these films from totally different countries have in common? You know, like in what ways are some of these things connecting, like all around the world? And some viewers definitely found that section the most confusing because they were expecting it to be geographical, where it's like one country, now another country, now another country, now another country, you know? And so the way that we would weave things in, I think people just were like, oh, this editing is so messy. Like, I don't understand this editing, you know? And then there's other people who were like, you have all the Asian countries mixed together as though they're one thing. And it's like, well, it's not really about Asian. It's more about, we're just looking at different mythologies from different places, and we're comparing them against each other. So we actually were trying to avoid a strictly geographical approach to the international section and have it be much more like abstract until.
No, I mean, I must admit, I know you've got talking heads in it, but for me, there was a lot of similarities between how Andrew Curtis cuts his films together in the sense it was like, in some ways, it's a meditation on folk horror as much as it is an investigation.
My editor was very influenced by Adam Curtis.
Okay, well, that makes sense then, yeah. Honestly.
So, I mean, I have certain things that I sort of brought saying that I want the editing to be like this. And for me, one of the movies, I think the first movie that I brought to her was a movie called Double Take by Johan Grimmenprez, which is like this kind of essay film, hybrid documentary about what happens on the set of The Birds when Alfred Hitchcock meets his double.
Okay.
And it's a really creepy movie that's also dealing with like, just like 9/11 and dealing with different interest. It's making like interesting political comparisons and stuff. It's a fascinating film, but it has this real creepiness to it. It's just infused with this creepiness. And so that was like the first movie I told my editor, I was like, you got to watch this movie because even though my movie is a movie about something, I also want it to feel like that thing, you know?
No, I mean, it definitely felt like I was being absorbed by the film, not watching the film as much as anything else, which was really exciting. And I think that's why in the second viewing, I was able to then lean into some of the details I hadn't been able to just pick up first time around. I mean, they obviously hit me, but there's a lot of information to consume in one sitting. Now, I spoke to David Gregory a long while ago while this film was in its kind of early days. We did 5 Great British Horror Films. And funny enough, I stopped doing 5 Great British Horror Films as a format because all I got was Blood on Satan's Claw, Witch Finder General, and The Wicker Man. And there's only so many times I want to talk about, I mean, they're brilliant films. Yeah. There's only so many times I want to spend 5 minutes talking about them with people. So I ended up just doing 5 of whatever anyone wants to do now. But we were talking, he had Blood on Satan's Claw on he was one of the early ones I did it with, and he had Blood on Satan's Claw. And at the time, Severin were doing a special Blu-ray or something that you were doing a extra for, which was this documentary on folk horror. So what was the trigger then that went, hold on a minute, this isn't an extra, this is a film that should be standalone itself? What was the tipping point for you?
I think, partially it was just that, like, I had started with a very small pool of people. Like, so I had proposed doing this short thing. I was supposed to interview a maximum of 6 people. Oh, my Next word. Thing you know, I had interviewed 10 or 12 people just for an extra, which is very unusual, you know, because most extras are just one person or 2 people, you know. So I'd interview like 12 people, and I started cutting together this rough cut. It's supposed to be like half an hour long. And it was like 2 hours and 10 minutes long, my rough cut. So it's longer than Blood on Satan's Claw.
Yeah, yeah.
And I told David, I was just, it was also my first time, like, writing, producing, editing, whatever, like a film on my own. Because even at Severin, up until that point, my job at Severin was just an editor. I was only an editor and only very basic. Like, I was not given like complicated projects. I was mostly like one interview with a person, and I have to edit it together and populate it with imagery. And David was the director, so I would be working off feedback from him. And so they were like assignments, and I would be reporting to David. And then when I proposed this folk horror thing, I wasn't even proposing it for myself to make it. I was just saying, like, somebody should make this. And David was just like, oh, just do it. And I was just like, just do it myself, like the whole thing myself. And he was like, yeah, sure. You know how to do it. Like, all the right people, the experts you should talk to or whatever. And I was just like, okay, I do. And I knew who some of our camera people were that we used in various places and stuff. And I was like, I guess technically I could do it myself, so, but it was the first like really complex thing I had edited with like 12 different people, weighing in like that. So I just didn't know how to cut it down at first. It was like, I was like, everything is interesting to me. Like, I don't know what to cut out of this because it's all interesting. And what would happen every time I would interview someone is that they would mention something I hadn't thought of. And I'd be like, oh, that's interesting. So then I'd have to go off another tangent talking about that thing, And so instead of getting smaller, it kept growing. And so when I handed in this rough cut, and I was just like, I do not know how to cut this down. I just feel like this topic is bigger, David was just like, well, don't cut it down then. He was like, how about instead of cutting, I mean, obviously he didn't want it to be 2 hours long, but he was just thinking like, you know, you have basically half of a feature film here, you know? So he was just like, instead of trying to think of ways to cut it, why don't you think of like, if you were hypothetically making a feature film about folk horror, who would be your wish list of who needs to be in it and what you need to talk about? If you really were thinking like you were going to make a feature about folk horror, what would have to be in it? And I was just like, well, I would do this and this and this. And he'd be like, well, do those things then, you know? So I got like animation. I got like Guy Madden doing collages. I got Jim Williams doing music. Like, I think some of those artistic things were the first things I went after, because I was like, well, I know it needs a score. I can't score it myself. I know it needs some kind of artistic flair or cinematic flair that I don't have. So it was like starting to get some animation done, getting the chapter headings done. And, you know, and then it came down to looking for an editor that had much more experience than me. You know, I was just like, if I was making a movie like this, I would not be the editor. I was like, I would kind of make a rough assembly, but I would actually hire an editor who knew much more about cutting features than me, you know? So then David allowed me to hire another editor. And so I got originally a guy named Benjamin Shern. And then he ended up having like a back injury that took him where he couldn't sit at his desk, you know, for like 6 months or something like that. And so that was when I, you know, started looking for another editor. And it took quite a while for me to find another editor that I liked as much as Ben, but also who I felt I could have a rapport with, you know, because partially I'd never made a movie before. So I wasn't super professional in how I dealt with people.
Okay.
I would just be like, no, I hate that. Move this here, do that, like very like kind of brusque and whatever. So it takes a certain type of person, I think, to be able to work with me, because I was like not the most diplomatic person. And so it really was kind of like, I wanted to find a person where I just felt like they got it already, you know, where they were not a jack of all trades editor that I was going to try to direct in a certain way, but where they were just an editor where it's like, this is also the way they think. And this is also the way they look at things. And we are just similar in a certain way. And then I just trust them, you know, to do things. And so that was how I eventually found Winnie Chung. And Winnie was not only a great editor, she totally got all this psychedelic shit that I wanted to do. I was like, I want the film to feel psychedelic, you know? Yeah. And so she was like, yes, that sounds great to me. But also she had way more experience making films than I did. So she ended up getting a producer credit on the movie because she ended up working out so much of the, like how the workflow should go, you know, in terms of like, if there's clips I want in the film, you know, making spreadsheets and having links and having all the information organized so that she and her assistant editor, because she also had an assistant editor named Jamie Lansdowne. And so that they would, you know, so anytime there was a still image or whatever, there was like really organized ways of letting them know where all the footage was stored and, you know, what sections it's supposed to go in and all that stuff. So she helped a lot with like a lot of those organizational things that I didn't have experience in. And then David Gregory came on at the end, like for the last like 2 months, because he's a co-producer, but it was kind of like I did it all myself until the end. When he came on, when we had to actually deliver the files and we had to make everything output in some professional way that's like up to current industry standards and whatever, he came in then is like, okay, this is how we need to do it. We need our post-production supervisor to get these files. We need this person to get these files. This person's, you know, so he kind of stepped in at that point and really brought it home, you know? So it was a really interesting process where I just was learning on the go. You know, I went from like having no clue how to do something like this to making like almost a 3.5 hour long documentary that people didn't hate, which was my only hope, was that it wasn't that people didn't like laugh at me and make fun of me when it was done.
Well, I suppose, you put so much in it, then you kind of, that's the least you want, the least you can hope to get in it, I suppose. But it is an amazing piece of work. And And it is 3 hours and 12 minutes, which is a long time. I remember when I first came across, like, Jesus, okay. And I did it in a one-er, I'll be honest with you, and I've done it with a one-er the second time. I don't break it up because I think it really does work as a piece of work. But I worked on I've only worked on one documentary from a kind of post point of view. And the mantra was, we need to get this to 90 minutes. It was like it wavered at 2 hours and we need to get, I think we compromised about 1 hour 45 or something.
Mm-hmm.
Presenting, David, here's a three hour documentary. Let's go. I mean, what was it before it got to 3 hours 12? Just for people, just as a you've discussed
like
quite.
It was like 2 hours longer.
Really?
So I would say by the time Winnie started editing it, because there was I had made a rough cut, rough assembly. I mean, it was a bit more detailed than an assembly. Like I had dropped everything, all the quotes in the order I wanted them. I had put clips in. Like I'd done quite a bit of stuff, so it was a bit more than an assembly. But by the time, Ben started working on it, and he did basically the very intro. He did the Signposts of British Folklore and the Unholy Trinity. And I think Signposts of British Folklore, he kind of did half of, and that was about the time he got injured. So when Winnie took over, it was like 5.5 hours long. Like because there was still all this other stuff that I had done that Ben hadn't touched yet, and so it was like 5.5 hours long. And I knew that we weren't going to be able to get it down to 90 minutes. And I knew we probably weren't going to be able to get it under 2 hours.
Yeah.
And, but I was sort of like 3 hours. I'm like 3 hours. I'm like, that seems like a good time for it to feel really comprehensive, but also not be like impossible for people to watch, but I was like, but that still leaves us with 2 hours that we have to cut out, And Winnie was so great because she would cut out all kinds of shit and I just wouldn't even notice it was gone. There's
the best type, eh?
There's stuff I notice now that's gone. Like in the sort of witchcraft and occult section, I had a whole little section about Alex and Maxine Sanders.
Okay.
Who were the British, like Alexandrian witchcraft. And so she cut them out. And I didn't notice until the film was done. And in hindsight, if I had noticed, I would have been okay with it being cut. But then I would have wanted a picture, at least, of Alex and Maxine Sanders put in with the other occult people that are mentioned, because otherwise it makes it seem like I forgot them or I don't know about them.
Yeah.
And so I regret that I didn't notice it, because I would have at least had some visual acknowledgement of them in there. Also, Blair Witch, I had a little thing of like Kevin Kolsch and Dennis Widmeyer talking about the Blair Witch Project, and somehow that got cut and I didn't notice. And so then nobody talks about the Blair Witch Project, and people are like, how is the Blair Witch Project not mentioned in this movie? And I'm like, it was there, and I didn't notice it was gone. And then also I had things like, I had title cards put in for movies that I didn't want to get forgotten, So like at one point I remember putting the movie The Hallow, like again and again, I kept putting insert the Hallow, just like a title card so that nobody would forget to insert the Hallow. Of course, that didn't get put in. And so then all kinds of people after the movie came out are like, oh, have you seen this movie, The Hallow? It's great. And I'm like, yes, I know. It was supposed to be in the movie and it got cut and I forgot or whatever.
Can I ask you, because I asked this to a lot of documentary filmmakers, because I mean, and it sounds like The Panel was one of the big revelations of what are these British films. But in terms of having done this exploration into folk horror, based on your perception going in, what for you was your favourite discovery about folk horror that you couldn't have imagined before you went on this journey?
I mean, my favorite discovery was basically that there was this very clear distinction between two types of folk horror, and that it was that, and the reason why so many people associate folk horror with Britain was for this reason, and it was that folk horror around the world folk horror in like countries that are not British colonies, basically. The folk horror, the folk practices and folk traditions tend to be the things that empower the protagonists to fight against the things that they're afraid of.
Yeah.
So the source of the horror is some kind of supernatural force or supernatural creature or something. And all the folk traditions are the things that fortify them and give them the knowledge and the strength and the traditional power to keep those scary things at bay. Whereas in British folk horror and in the kinds of folk horror that moved to the US from Britain and to Australia from Britain, the horror is the people who believe those things.
Okay. Yeah, I get you.
So it's not the monsters, it's not the ghosts, it's not whatever. It's like the people who believe in those old practices, they are the source of the horror. And so it's like these two totally different types of folk horror. And it's like, okay, you can see why people consider folk horror to be British, because if you look at something like Adam Scoville's folk horror chain and a lot of the theories about folk horror, it is very much focused on like the villagers, the isolated village, and some stranger going into that village and discovering that they're going to be part of this pagan sacrifice or something, you know, that the villagers have these like weird old beliefs, and the city person or whatever wanders into this community and discovers this horrible situation that they have to get out of. And so a lot of like definitions that people had about what folk horror is were really based on that kind of story structure. And that is very like, it's like a British folk story structure, you know, like that's one of the oldest story types in like British folk horror.
Yeah.
And
Wicker Man being an absolute textbook example, isn't it?
Right. But I mean, in literature, in folk horror literature, it goes back like 100 years earlier, those story types. And so it was like, wow, there actually is a dividing line. And this is why people always thought folk horror was British, is that the definition was always very much focused on like the kind of evil villagers, you know? And yet when you go in these other places around the world, the folk traditions are actually good things. They are not the scary things. They are the things that actually help you. And that also means a lot for like marginalized communities and stuff who had belief systems that other people are trying to suppress, you know? So depending on what the viewpoint of the protagonist is, it changes what is the source of the horror, you know?
Do you know, in a way, I wrote a screenplay based in Norway, and essentially what you're describing was one of the biggest story challenges I had, which is trying to get my head around the fact that the folk horror I was tapping into wasn't the bad guy. And that was kind of, it's interesting. You just read what you've just told me now, because I went through a year or so of fighting this, because obviously I'm coming at it from a, you know, just instinctively from a British point of view. I don't think I've been brainwashed, but you kind of are used to a storytelling tradition that you go outside, and once you venture beyond the city limits and you end up in the places where the ground gets muddier, that there's things to fear. And they're out to get you because I don't know what it is you think you've got they want to take, but you know, but it is that sort of thing. That's really interesting. I mean, I genuinely went through that kind of understanding myself. I never thought about it in such logical terms, but certainly did. Yeah.
Yeah. Now,
I did speak to, I messaged David to say I was speaking to you, and I said, what would be a good question to ask you? And two of the things he gave me, one of them was how the pandemic helped the festival distribution for the film.
Oh, well, I don't think there would have been much festival distribution for the film if it wasn't for the pandemic. I think that the fact that everybody switched to online festivals, you know, meant that, because normally when you have an in-person festival, they're paying for the theater. The festival is paying for the venue, and the venue rentals are based on time slots. So every time slot is like 2 hours, and then you got to pay again for the next time slot. So if my film had been playing at an in-person festival, they would have had to pay 2 venue rentals just to play my one movie. And that is a real deterrent to a programmer. They're like, well, we could get a whole other movie in there if we didn't play this movie, you know? And so the fact that it was online meant that people didn't give a shit how long it was.
Amazing.
It could have been 10 hours long and they could have still programmed it, you know, because they're like, they don't have any venue expenses. So that was not part of they didn't have to think about that. But it's something that programmers have to think about even with short films.
It sounds like the big version of keep it under 10 minutes if it's a short film sort of thing, you know, because it's easier to program 9 10-minute shorts than it is to try and get 30-minute shorts in.
Right. Yeah. So you know that if you program a 30-minute short, you're sacrificing all these other potential films you can play. And so it was sort of like that, where I felt like the pandemic gave it a festival visibility it just wouldn't have had otherwise.
And his other question is, are you done with folk horror or is there more to explore?
I don't even know if I'm allowed to answer that question. I will just say, no, I'm not done.
Brilliant. We're going to do 5 great folk horror films that featured in Woodlands Dark and Days Bewitched. And just to remind people, the format is Kayla's giving me 5 films. We're going to go through each one. We're going to talk for 5 minutes about each one. And when the alarm goes off, we're going to move on to the next one. So when you hear... that is when it adds a little bit of jeopardy, Kayla. So, you know, to the chat. Sometimes it feels like it takes forever. Sometimes it just goes like that. I don't know. You tell me. Yeah. But moving on, and God, I'm going to butcher some of these names. Hopefully, not too bad in terms of pronunciation. First out the bat is 1963's Il Demonio.
Il Demonio.
Demonio. Okay, there we go.
Yeah.
I've pronounced demon myself now, can I?
Prime Day is coming July 16th and 17th. With epic deals exclusively for Prime members, you'll feel like you just won an award.
Oh, wow. I didn't even prepare a speech. I'd like to thank my family for always needing stuff. Also, Sam, my delivery guy, for bringing all my awesome deals so fast. You're the man, Sam!
Shop deals on electronics, home, and more this Prime Day, July 16th and 17th.
What's the easiest choice you can make? Window instead of middle seat? Picking a vendor who sends a great gift basket? Outsourcing business tasks you hate? What about selling with Shopify? Whether you're selling a little or a lot, Shopify helps you do your thing, however you cha-ching. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. From the launch your online shop stage to the first real-life store stage, all the way to the did we just hit 1 million orders stage. Shopify's there to help you grow. Whether you're selling scented soap or offering outdoor outfits, Shopify helps you sell. Wherever and whatever you're selling, Shopify's got you covered. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/try. Go to shopify.com/try now to grow your business, no matter what stage you're in. Shopify.com/try.
Is your vehicle stopping like it should? Does it squeal or grind when you brake? Don't miss out on summer brake deals at O'Reilly Auto Parts.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
Yes. So I'm just supposed to talk about this film.
Tell me why it's interesting and why you chose it for the film or where it fits in the film if you want. I mean, by all means.
Okay.
I
mean, like it's one of the films that we released on Severin, on the box set we did at Severin, the All the Haunts Be Ours, which is like a big 20 film box set of folk horror films. And to me, it was like, one of the big, I don't want to say discoveries because I had heard of it long before I saw it, but it's when I started doing my folk horror research, it came up and I was just like, oh yeah, yes, like this film, I have heard about this film forever. I've seen images from it forever, but had never actually watched it. So beautiful film about, it's like a story of obsessive love that's set in Southern Italy. It's like in this like Southern Italy where Christianity has integrated a lot of the older superstitious beliefs. So there's this really weird tentative relationship between, what is obviously a very Catholic town, but with all these old kind of root traditions and, nature magic and stuff like this, And Dahlia Lavi plays the main character, this character named Purif. And Dahlia Lavi is best known to horror fans because she played the lead in Mario Bava's film, The Whip and the Body.
Okay.
And so in this film, she plays a woman who, I guess some people have viewed her character as being like slightly simple. Some people have viewed her character as being like potentially autistic. But in the case of this movie, it's like she has like a lover played by Frank Wolf, who is deciding that he's getting married, but he's getting married to a more prominent woman in the town, a more respected woman than Purif, who is a bit more like feral, and she's very like she has a lot of sexual energy, and she's like a wild woman in a way, and so he's getting married to this more respectable woman. And so Purif just kind of like loses herself in obsession for this guy. And the town, because of the types of beliefs they have, they interpret a lot of her behavior as though she's demonically possessed. And so they feel that she's possessed because she's exhibiting like hysterical behavior. So they kind of turn against her. Well, they do. They turn against her with physical and even sexual violence. And some of the examples of like some of the, hysterical behavior is she does this spider walk. And this is a spider walk, where she's like doing the backwards spider walk. And the actress, Dahlia Lavi.
The classic like an exorcism trope, isn't it now? In it.
Yes. But that is, I remember when I first saw the film, I was like, oh, wow, this predates The Exorcist. And a lot of other people online are like, wow, this predates The Exorcist by 10 years. But I think, as I think Kat Ellinger pointed out, she did a commentary for the film on our disc. And I think she was the one who pointed it out to me that, she's like, actually, I don't think Exorcist is inspired by Il Demonio. I don't know if William Friedkin would have seen this movie, but they're both inspired by the same literary sources, right? Which is that there was an ethnographer named Ernesto Di Martino who went around Italy documenting old folk traditions. And this was a very, very common manifestation of so-called possession in southern Italy, the spider walk. And so there is actually a lot of documentation about this behavior. And so that is imagery that is associated with demonic possession. So she's just like, I don't think Friedkin got his example from this movie necessarily. I think it's just that as he was doing all kinds of research into possession, that would have come up as an image.
So you say that this is a thing common to Italy, not that it was in Italian literature or folk literature generally.
Italian. I meant literature in terms of like anthropological literature, not like narrative literature.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's like folkloric studies, and it was Ernesto Di Martino was an anthropologist.
Wow, amazing!
So these were like his studies, and this is like mid-century, So I think he died in the around the time this movie was made, actually. And so his studies would have been, mid-century of the last century. Do we have the bark already?
There we go. There's the first alarm.
The only other thing I wanted to point out about that movie that I didn't discover until because Il Demonio is actually also in the new edition of my House of Psychotic Women book.
Okay.
So it kind of fit both things that I was working on. And one of the things that came up as I was doing my House of Psychotic Women book is actually that her character is also very similar to a character she plays in a movie 2 years earlier. Michel Boisron made a movie called One Night at the Beach, and Dahlia Lavi, like a lot of her character, but her mannerisms, all kinds of stuff is actually, she's already working it out in this earlier movie, like 2 years before. And so that was a really interesting thing to discover too.
I should have said at the start, I haven't seen any of these 5 films, and that's what's blown my mind.
Oh, really?
No. And the next one is the one that I'm going to be hunting out first in terms of in Eye of the Devil from 1966, starring David Niven, because the very fact it starred David Niven, I'm like, why don't I know about this film at all? Do you want to? Where does this fit into? I mean, obviously, it's set in a French vineyard, but obviously got a British influence. So where does it fit in that sort of divide you were talking about in terms of what folklore and folk horror is.
Well, it's interesting because the fact that it's in the French village, it's interesting because you don't actually see the villagers at all. The villagers do not really play a role in the film at all. I mean, it's described as a proto Wicker Man film. Like a lot of people describe it that way because it's 1966 and it's before the Wicker Man, and it's also before the book that the Wicker Man was based on. Eye of the Devil is based on a book by suspense writer Robin Estridge, who used the name Philippe Lorraine to write it. And I think the novel came out in like 1964. And it's very, it's David Niven plays a guy who is from an aristocratic family in France. And he's summoned back to the family estate, which is this massive chateau, because the vineyards are failing. And so there's some sort of occult rituals and some sacrifice that everything is building up to that has to be done to save the vineyards from failing. So obviously it's what the aristocratic feudal lord of this land, it's what he's required to do to keep the villagers sustained. But you never actually meet the villagers. It's all set in this very like the aristocratic bubble of the chateau and the weird people who like live and work at the chateau. So it's like he goes back there, and Deborah Kerr is like his wife or his fiance. Maybe she's his wife because they have children. She follows him out there. She's like, he's like, I need to go back to the castle. And she follows him, even though he tells her not to, and brings I can't remember if she brings the children. She does bring the children. Of course she does. There's amazing scenes with the children. And she goes out there and she's like, Philippe, what is happening? You're behaving so unlike yourself, and he's like, you must leave. You must not be here, and it's very dramatic. And, and she's trying to discover like, what is the secret of the castle and like, who are the weird people? Because like, David Hemmings and Sharon Tate are in the film, and Sharon Tate is like, it's billed as introducing her. It's billed as her first film. But there's like another film called Don't Make Waves that also bills her as it being her first film. So I think one was made first and one was released first. And so they both like fought over which one of them gets to claim her. Yeah. But so anyway, so her and David Hemmings in the movie, they play brother and sister. They're not brother and sister in the book. They're not related in the book. And, but they're brother and sister in the movie, which is a big part of what lends the film its sexual deviance. There's this real like underlying theme of sexual deviance in this whole chateau, and their relationship. David Hemmings and Sharon Tate are playing very weird characters, and that's a big part of like creating that energy. But it's very much, films like Robin Redbreast and Eye of the Devil have been cited, I think, the most often as like proto Wicker Man movies, that are dealing with this. The idea of like the harvest failing and, a sacrifice has to be made for the harvest, But yeah, so it is that type of film, and it's made by J. Lee Thompson, who would, he was a British director, but he was known, I think, before this, he had made The Guns of Navarone and Cape Fear. Yeah. And then my generation, being the age I am, I mostly know him as the director of Happy Birthday to Me, which is like Canadian slasher film. But Eye of the Devil, of everything of his I have seen, Eye of the Devil is my favorite by far. I love this film. It's amazing. Like we would have totally included it in our folk horror box set, except it's like an MGM film, and we're not big enough for like the studios to really deal with us that much. And
this was a proper like X certificate, wasn't it, when it was released? Like I
don't know. I mean, like maybe in the UK. I don't think this was an X-rated movie. In the US.
No. I mean, but in horror terms, in '66, it's like that. It wasn't that long before we were still, our government was still, the British government was still reading theatre plays, whether you could put a theatre on, a theatre production on. Oh, there we go. You almost instinctively knew the 5 minutes there. Right, then moving into the 70s, and we're going to be following a wandering ballad singer in the Appalachians for the legend of Hillbilly John.
Yes. Although it's actually pronounced Appalachia, even though everybody in my movie pronounces it wrong.
So what, you drop the N, or you drop the N, or the N isn't there?
One of my interviewees who lives in Appalachia, he's still in the movie. He says Appalachia, and it's Appalachia.
So Appalachia, but if it's Appalachians, if you meet them,
yeah. But so yeah, the Legend of Hillbilly John from 1974 was also. It was originally titled "Who Fears the Devil," which is the title of both a longer original cut of the film, but also the name of one of the stories. Like, it's based on the stories of the author Manly Wade Wellman. So he had, he was like a fantasy and horror writer, and his one of his biggest successes, was creating this character named John. I think he just called him John, but then other critics and historians came to call him Silver John or John the Balladeer. And so he wrote many stories of, about this character, Silver John, who is a wandering Appalachian balladeer, And one of those stories is called Who Fears the Devil, which is why that's what the movie was called. And also in my documentary, there's the American chapter of the documentary is called Call Me From the Valley. And that is also the name of a Silver John book. So I mean, like, Manly Wade Wellman wrote these stories where, I mean, he got very interested in Appalachian folklore and spiritualities. And also there was a folk musician, and it's, again, mid-century of the last century. There was a folk musician, Aubrey Ramsey. That's his name, Aubrey Ramsey. So Manly Wade Wellman met him and became very fascinated with this folk singer. And I have a feeling that a lot of Silver John's personality and the idea of him being a folk singer was inspired by Manly Wade Wellman meeting this folk singer.
Okay.
And so he was really interested in the folklore of this region. And it's one of the richest regions for folklore in the US, because there are a lot of old traditions that still survive there, that are still really strong. And there's a lot of old beliefs that are still practiced there. And they have kind of like a big folklore center in Appalachia. There's like a university. There's a university that has like the biggest folklore like archive and folklore studies center and stuff, like Amazing. In the US. So it's very, very strong. Like, a lot of people who come from Appalachia, like academics and stuff like that, this will become something that they champion and an area that they focus on, partially because Appalachia is still a very misunderstood region, around the US. So I think there's a lot of people, like, when they come from that area and they are scholars or writers or whatever, they often are trying to do right by Appalachia because they feel like it's been wrong by a lot of the rest of the country, who think it's just full of like backwoods hicks and stuff, like, who are going to kill you or shoot you if you go on their property and blah, blah, blah. And we address some of these stereotypes.
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to say this film's a great example of what you were discussing before about the need to sort of move geographically when you talk about American folk horror.
Yeah,
because Appalachia versus the southern states, they're not the same country, are they?
Yeah. Although there's definitely crossover, because there was like people who a century or two later, like after people started settling in Appalachia, there was definitely people who moved from the South because the South was very depressed, and there was and also like slaves, like after the slaves were emancipated, a lot of people moved into Appalachia. So it's also a really interesting place in terms of mixing of cultures. And so the folk magic there is also in some ways very influenced by Southern, like African-American folk magic and stuff too. There's a lot of that kind of integrated into the Appalachian folk magic. So it's just a fascinating area. And so the Legend of Hillbilly John is, I comparatively silly movie compared to the way I've just been speaking about Appalachia. It's pretty silly movie, but it's full of great music. The guy who plays Silver John is played by a folk musician named Hedges Capers. And so he does all the music and, does the songs in the movie and stuff. But yeah, I'm hoping that in the future, people will be hearing some more about Hillbilly John. That's all I will say.
Okay. Well, look, for fear of offending our Brazilian friends, I won't try to pronounce this next title. Do you want to give us what the next title is, please?
Yeah. So the next title is As Filhas do Fogo from 1978. I don't know that I'm pronouncing it correctly either, but I've had to say it many times, so I just probably have more practice than you. So
yeah, no, it was more the Filhas bit, and it feels a bit right based on my knowledge of Brazilian footballers that I know that play in Britain. So that it feels right. So a woman living in Sao Paulo is at the centre of the story. What is it about this? What does this tell us about folk horror from a South American or specifically Brazilian point of view?
Yeah. So she's the main protagonist in the film are from São Paulo, but they don't. The film doesn't take place there. It's just kind of like a girl goes back to her family home in the country and brings her friend from the city with her. So the two of them go back to this country home, which is in the southern part of Brazil. And the main thing I love about this film, and I really wish it could be remastered and stuff, we have been trying, but it documents the, it's just interesting in regards to folk horror because it specifically conjures the Germanic traditions that were imported to southern Brazil in the 19th century. So there was a huge movement of German people to this region of Brazil. And so if you go to southern Brazil, you'll come across towns that look like alpine towns. They look like German towns, and they have Germanic festivals, like a Bratwurst festival or whatever, So, I mean, this isn't Brazilian in the way that a lot of people think of Brazilian, where they're thinking much more of Afro-Brazilian or indigenous Brazilian. I mean, this is imported Germanic people. I mean, and there's such a big German population there. That was why, after World War II, people started hunting Nazis in Brazil, because there was, in South America, there was a huge German population. And so that's where all the Nazi war criminals would be sought, was in Brazil and stuff. And so this film deals a lot with the girl goes there and she's telling her friend the history of this place. Yes, my great grandfather came here and he had a really hard time trying to, just raise the area and get rid of the beliefs, the local beliefs, so that he could bring the proper German beliefs here and stuff, And so it's all kind of building up to this German harvest festival. And it's interesting because there are these photographs all throughout the movie they show that are supposed to be pictures of the German Harvest Festival in the past, but all the photos are actually Diane Arbus photos. So Diane Arbus, the American photographer, clearly used without permission in this movie. Somebody used I didn't even catch it. Somebody else told me, they were oh no, those are Diane Arbus pictures because I posted one of them on my Instagram. And so then I looked it up and it's they're all from some Diane Arbus photo book that came out in the 70s. And so they use these pictures in the movie as though they are the documentation of this old German harvest festival, which is really interesting. But it also has a lot of, it has an investigation into electronic voice phenomena and what we would call stone tape theory and stuff,
Wow.
So there's this mix of kind of electronic voice phenomena and what was known as Kardecist spiritism, which became very popular in, it's named after this French scholar named Alain Kardec. And it became very popular in the middle of the 19th century in Brazil and became one of the dominant belief systems, Kardecist spiritism.
Jesus, really?
So there's a lot of this in the film. And at some point I had, because they're dealing with recordings, from the past and stuff, I at one point in the documentary, I had as Filhas de Fogo, the Stone Tape, and Pupi Avadi's film Zeder actually all edited together into a sequence because I was trying to show the way that they each use like technology and stuff like this. And that ended up getting cut out of the movie. But so I just found this movie interesting because it's touching on so many interesting things. It's like got this very regional specificity to it, but it's also dealing with immigration, and it's also dealing with like belief systems that are being imported around the world. You know, like it's just, fascinating film. And then one of the actresses in it is this woman, Paulo Moura, who would be known more to like Severin Films fans. She's in like Images from a Convent or Images in a Convent and Killer Nun. So she's like in like 2 nunsploitation movies. And so at the time this movie was made, she had been like Italian Playboy and stuff. So she's like an Italian actress in this Brazilian.
Is this a film? Is this a film that you discovered while making the documentary? Or is this a film you knew about when you went into making it?
I knew about it before because I was actually researching Brazilian genre films for something else. Okay. And so whenever I came across something that kind of was folk horror-y, I can't remember if I was working on folk horror at the same time or if I started working on folk horror later, but either way, I found this film before I was working on the folk horror thing, and I sort of recalled it, was like, oh yeah, that movie can go in there, you know.
Cool. Well, look, final throw of the dice is we're jumping into the 90s now with, I mean, this, I'm feeling, I don't know this one either. So Clearcut from 1991. And this is about, is this American or Canadian film? Canadians. This is about Indigenous Canadians, isn't it? Is this what this touches on?
Yeah. So it's a movie that's about this like white lawyer who is defending, and I don't know if he's just been assigned to defend or he's volunteered to defend. I don't know that anybody has asked him to defend them, but like he's defending an Indigenous community that is fighting against loggers that are cutting down trees on their territory, you know. And this is an ongoing problem in Canada where, you know, there's just treaty after treaty that just gets broken and ignored by developers whenever they need to, you know. It's like there is sovereign Indigenous land all over Canada. There's also a lot of unceded land, like land where there was never a treaty. Like where I live, white people are not supposed to be living here. You know, like it was never British Columbia, the West Coast. There was never any treaty that allowed white people to live here. So it's not even the case of a broken treaty. It's actually the case of like full on just invasion into Indigenous territory without caring, you know? And so these issues are just huge, big issues all across Canada, you know, where it's like you're dealing with shitty things that people did centuries ago, but they are still, not only is there not reparations for it, but it's like they're keeping more injuries to the, you know, to what little land the Indigenous people have in Canada. And there's still people who are like trying to sell a pipeline project that goes through the Indigenous land or whatever. In the case of Clearcut, it came out a year after, very close on the heels of what was in Canada called the Oka crisis, or the Kanesatake resistance. And so this was like a 78-day standoff in 1990. It was like from summer to fall of 1990. So it was a 78-day standoff between Mohawk protesters, Quebec police, the RCMP, which is like the federal police, and the Canadian Army. So it was like a standoff because there was a golf course that was expanding, and there was developers building townhouses on disputed land in Kanesatake. And in that Indigenous land, there was also a burial ground. So there's like a Mohawk burial ground. And so the developers were basically just doing whatever the hell they want. And the Indigenous people, the Mohawk people from that region, were just like, no more, you know? And so there was like a standoff.
Right.
And it was, you know, it was a very strong image of Indigenous resistance in Canada. Like the imagery of like all the Indigenous people in military fatigues with like bandanas over their faces and stuff. you know, like there's just, I know somebody who's like in a famous photograph as a baby, you know, like in one of the famous photographs from this resistance. And so it was like a real turning point in Canada where it was kind of the first time for many Canadians that they understood anything about Indigenous grievances, you know, because it got a lot of press. And so Clearcut came out a year later, not even a year later. And it was met with a lot of reluctance, you know, like it didn't get played a lot. It was not really pushed. I mean, because they were afraid to kind of release it. There was a lot of critical resistance to it because there's a very violent Indigenous character in it. Graham Greene, who's one of the greatest Canadian actors, plays a trickster character named Arthur. And I call him a trickster because he does play like a trickster character. You know, he's a supernatural character.
Right.
That his role is not to be a nice character. His role is to disrupt. You know, his role is to point out problems. And sometimes he can do that in quite a disruptive and violent way. And so his character is very violent. His character is very rude and mean. And, you know, I think he's a great character, you know, but it's like, I think there was a lot of worry from not only mainstream critics and left-leaning critics and stuff, but also Indigenous communities at the time that they weren't sure they really wanted this depiction of like a violent Indigenous activist, like so close after the Oka situation. It was just kind of like, you know, we don't want Canadians to be like afraid of us. We want to be respected, you know, so we don't want to be depicted as like indiscriminately violent people, you know, which is what Arthur kind of is. He kind of revels in his violence, you know. And so it took a long time for the movie to find its audience. I would say in the last couple of years, it has found its audience. And not only that, it's found a lot of Indigenous champions. There actually are a lot of Indigenous critics and stuff who now love this film. And Graham Greene, the actor, has said that it's his favorite role that he ever played, you know. So it's been kind of reclaimed in a way. Like it had bad timing when it came out, but it's a really, really fascinating film.
Well, look, thank you for sharing those 5 films. I will repeat that Woodlands, Darkened Days, Bewitched is on Shudder, but let's get a couple of things. You've reissued House of Psychotic Women, is that right?
Yeah.
So
so Fab Press, it's the 10th anniversary of the book this year. So Fab Press just reissued it with there's 100 more movies added to it, and there's also a new preface at the beginning. So it's like an expanded anniversary edition.
Okay, well, I'll put links to that in the show notes. And you also mentioned the box set. So what's the box set that Severin did on folk horror?
Severin did a box set called All the Haunts Be Ours. And it's a 20-film folk horror box set that comes with like a book. It's a fantastic set. And the films are from all over the place, you know. Yeah. So it's got like Serbian films and British films and, you know, Polish films and all kinds of stuff. So it's like a bunch of the films that people may not have seen or heard of from the documentary. Yeah. We tried to get a lot of those into this set. So,
and is it physically available, Woodlands?
Yeah, you can buy a Blu-ray from Severin. You can buy it on Amazon. I don't know whether in the UK, whether it would, I'm pretty sure it's an all region disc that would be available from Severin because we produce the film, so we have world rights on it, you know. I think like if there's any disc you get on Amazon, it'll be region free probably.
Brilliant. Well, look, I'll put a link in the show notes to Severin's website. Well, it just gives me to say thank you very much for giving your time on the podcast.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
And honestly, congratulations on the film. It is an amazing piece of work. You must be very proud.
Thank you.
And can I just add, just to finish the fanboy session, Satanic Panic is a wonderful book as well that you put out, you edited on Fab Press. It's like... Thank
you. Well, actually, I didn't put that out on Fab Press. Fab Press sublicensed it from me. I actually published that. I originally published it under my own imprint, Spectacular Optical.
Okay.
And then when we sold out, I don't like doing reprints because usually I just want to move on to something else. So when it sold out, I contacted Fab Press and asked if they wanted to sublicense it. So they did it's exactly the same. It just says Fab Press on it. But yeah, so they just sublicensed it from me. So that was a book that Paul Korup and I put together. And Spectacular Optical, which has been pretty dormant for a few years now. But it was a publishing imprint that I was running and did a few books through.
Yeah, no, it always feels like the Satanic Panic of North America is the Video Nasties of the UK. It's like the strange folk devil phenomena that obsess the conservative part of the nation rather too much that they came up with the most whacked out theories, and your book covers it brilliantly. Well, look, I will say thank you very much now. Let you get on with your day. Much appreciated.
Have you made the switch to Knix? Millions of women have made the switch to the revolutionary period underwear from Knix. That's Knix. Period panties from Knix are like no other, making them the #1 leak-proof underwear brand in North America. They're comfy, stylish, and absorbent, perfect for period protection from your lightest to your heaviest days. They look, feel, and machine wash just like regular underwear, but feature incognito protection that has you covered. You can shop sizes from extra small to 4XL. Choose from all kinds of colors, prints, and different styles, from bikinis to boy shorts, thongs to high-rise. You've got to try Knix. See why millions are ditching disposable, wasteful period products and have switched to Knix. Go to knix.com and get 15% off with promo code TRY15. That's Knix.com, promo code TRY15 for 15% off life-changing period underwear. That's knix.com.